what's happening on Wall Street.
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time. How are you, Johnny?
I'm very good.
I see your big hero, Bob Dylan, is 80 this year.
Do you know what? You reminded me of that. I totally forgot. But my mother's only 88.
That's a very good point. I just have to tell you that John destroyed for a number of years my musical taste by not only introducing me to Bob Dylan when we were kids, but kind of a barrage. It was like a Gaza City sort of barrage of Bob Dylan rockets coming into our house.
I don't see it like that at all. I see that I enlightened you, Macker, into the world of fantastic lyrics, and he was just amazing. But I will tell you this.
Tell me it.
When Dylan came, 84 was it?
Yeah, it's the worst concert I was ever at.
It was also my worst concert.
It was so bad it was kind of good.
But I've seen him about 3 or 4 times since, and I will never go and see him again.
Because he's just brutal.
He's just brutal.
He doesn't give.
Yeah.
You got to go to the well when you're doing these things.
Yeah.
You really do. It was funny though. I was thinking about Dylan just before we started talking. The last time I was out, because I know we're going to be out quite soon, right?
Yeah, out and bad, as Marlowe said.
I was in New York, in Broadway, Conor McPherson's play, The Girl from the North County.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Dylan contacted Conor McPherson, the Irish playwright, and said, here's my back catalogue, have it.
Yeah.
Right.
That was amazing.
It was extraordinary. So I went along, and it was the preview nights. They were all like the New York Times sort of review critics. And this was a big deal for Conor, obviously, because New York Times can destroy Broadway, right?
Yeah.
And the critic from the New York Times gave it an amazing review. But the day afterwards, the entire Broadway closed down for the first time ever because of COVID. So I was in New York on the Saturday before. Right. So remember that the COVID hit here on that weekend? I was in New York that weekend.
Right. Yeah.
And it's amazing to think how many of these theatres will actually recover. How many of these businesses will recover? How many, bars, theatres, restaurants, all these things. Because later on, I want to talk to you about Anthony Bourdain.
Right.
And restaurants, right? And a concept of the city. But it just struck me that, the amount of money ploughed into these big productions all over the world. And all that money's gone.
Yeah.
And you wonder, Broadway didn't even close, think about it, in the Second World War or in the Spanish flu.
Right.
And it closed in this time.
Wow, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, and the West End in London.
And of course, like we've been saying all the way along, is all the kind of actors and musicians and...
Yeah,
by the way, he's drinking water with ice and it's not a cocktail.
It's a real shame. That's a real shame.
But actually, let me ask you one more question then. Was Dylan actually at that performance?
No. Conor told me that Dylan has come to one... I think it was Conor had a play called The Seafarer, which also opened in New York, and I also saw it.
Right.
And it's not that I go to New York all the time to theatre.
Sounds like it.
But the last...
Pop over for a bit of shopping.
No, but the last couple of times I happened to be there, he happened to be there, and there was something... And Dylan apparently went incognito to The Seafarer and liked it so much and liked Conor McPherson's work that he said, look, I'm going to give this guy... I'm going to trust this guy. It's an amazing story, isn't it? And it's a story that most Irish theatre people or artistic people don't know, that Bob Dylan gave Conor McPherson his back catalogue. Now, think of the amount of trust.
Yeah.
Like, think of the amount of times Steven Spielberg would have approached Dylan for his back catalogue. Or any of those big movie moguls, right? And yet he picked an Irish playwright. And he said...
I haven't seen that, and I'd love to see The Girl from North County.
Yeah, it's about Dulwich. Is that where he's from?
Duluth, Minnesota.
Yeah, and Dylan's parents ran a B&B boarding house in the Great Depression. So it's about the characters who ended up in the boarding house.
Right.
Kind of down and outs, people down on their luck. Again, the sort of people that Bourdain is talking about, we're going to talk about in a minute. People running away from crimes or ex-wives or ex-husbands.
But you can imagine Conor McPherson sitting there and Dylan says, take my catalogue. Where do you begin?
Well, that's the point. And he's very interested in that, Conor, because he said, look, I didn't want to go down the, like a Rolling Stone, all the greats.
Yeah,
he said, I wanted to find some sort of unusual ones that were maybe address the issue of the Great Depression. And when Dylan was writing those, that in the back of his head was his parents' experience in the Great Depression as the B&B owners. I just think it's a lovely thing, but we could talk about this all night. In actual fact, we're going to play out with somebody I've been listening to recently who I think is the new Dylan.
Ooh.
Okay, yes.
Who that?
An English, gorgeous voice, amazing lyrics, singer called Arlo Parks. Let's do it later on. Anyway.
And who, by the way, won the Brit Awards last week.
So you know these things. I don't know these things.
Yeah, well, I ended up watching that. It was just ridiculous. Just nonsense. Well, I hate award shows, but I ended up watching that.
No, the awards. Well, in actual fact, on the TV, we're going to talk about the TV show that I saw this week and how it reflects economics. It's a conversation between Anthony Bourdain and Debbie Harry of Blondie. And it was about New York in the 70s, but actually it was about the housing market. So let's talk about that. But first, John, we're going to talk about, is inflation back?
Mac, over the course of 2 years now, we're podcasting.
I know. I hate this. Can't stand the sight of them.
But
I used to only see you about once every few months.
Yeah, I know.
Now you're living here.
Yeah, I'm living here.
Get out of the place, will you? It's like a little kid's
Honey, I'm home.
John's room. It's like a wild teenager in there.
But come here, let's talk economics.
All right, Sunshine.
Over the last while, you've always been saying that we need a little bit of inflation. Just to get the economy buzzing again.
Yeah.
But interest rates have been so low for the last while that inflation hasn't budged at all. But apparently, the consumer prices and consumer inflation has risen to 4.2% in America.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And what's the impact of that?
That has spooked the hell out of all sorts of financial markets, because the working assumption for all these people, and I'm going to break it down in a second of what it's all about, was that we are in a deep deflationary period, precipitated by COVID, and as a consequence of that, inflation will not reemerge for quite some time. And the Federal Reserve has been very, very chilled about that and said, you know what, we're not worried about inflation. And then, of course, lots and lots of people have said the Fed will wait until they almost see the whites in the eyes of inflation before increasing the interest rate.
Right.
And people are saying now, well, hold on, those eyes look pretty white. 4.2% is 100% above the inflation target. So the Fed's target is inflation between 0 and 2%. Okay? Yeah. Implicit, not explicit, but implicit, right? When you go to 4%, you're saying, hold on a second, you're not only missing your target, but in actual fact, it's way beyond it. And of course, there's been a hissy fit in financial markets, and people are saying this is the end of this period of very, very low interest rates.
Is this being blamed on Biden, by the way?
No. I mean, only Egypt's say the president is responsible. Fox News probably says it is, right?
No, I'm sure they do.
But the first thing is, the most critical thing about statistics is you never take just one print and say, this is a trend, okay?
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is year-on-year inflation is basically, it measures the consumer price index this year vis-a-vis last April. So there's a thing called base effects in statistics, right? Now, base effects is how the base affects the actual figure. So if inflation fell dramatically last April and even was the same this April, the year-on-year figure would be much higher. Do you see what I mean? So basically, if last April there was something happened in the world that inflation fell, then you're comparing last April to this April, the base effect will actually drive inflation upwards, not downwards.
Yeah.
And then you think, was there a base effect? And you think, what happened last April? Last April, we have the first month of the lockdown. People aren't going out, restaurants, bars, etc., shops, right?
Yeah.
So how do shops react? They drop their prices because everyone thought that we would be out of the pandemic in 6 weeks. Remember?
Yeah.
Right? So everyone thought, so everyone thought at the time, okay, this ain't going to happen. This ain't going to go on for a year. So we'll drop prices now. We'll be in a good position. We'll coax people back in. You know what? We'll all be out in May. We'll have lower prices. They'll come in. Of course, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So again, the first thing about statistics is always look underneath the hood, as the Yanks would say. Look at the figure, right? So the base effect, very important. Then the second thing is the one-off increases in certain prices. So for example, I was telling you, airline prices gone through the roof.
Yeah.
And used car prices gone through the roof as well in the United States. That all impacts. Interestingly, and it's bizarre, rents are continuing to fall in America. So rents have actually not gone up. And this is again because of the fact that people are leaving the big cities. And so when people are leaving San
Right.
Francisco and New York and all these places,
They've been forced out.
yeah, they've been forced out. Well, no, the pandemic forced a lot of them out.
Yeah.
And they've said, okay,
They've gone home.
They've gone home.
Yeah,
So
to not
again, because the American market is much, much more vibrant, much more sensitive to demand than our own market, right? What you see is all this. So my attitude is we should be quite chilled. Wait until we see the next couple of months. But then there is one big imponderable, and it's the role of China. And I know you like China because it reminds you of Donald Trump. Right. So for the last 20 years, China has been what they call a disinflationary force in the world economy. So
Right.
what has happened is because so much of American production has shifted from high-cost America to low-cost China. And then those goods that were produced in low-cost China are re-exported to America, the same goods at lower prices.
Yeah.
So China is exporting deflation, if you get that, right? China, the influence of China is that the price of cars is going down, the price of iPhones, the
Yeah.
price of all this technology, right,
Yeah.
is going down. Because what had been made in the United States was what they call offshored to China.
Yeah.
What had therefore been expensive, because American wages are much more expensive than Chinese wages, or were, right, becomes cheap. And then that goes back in. Imagine global inflation to be like a relay race,
Yeah.
right? That I'm passing the baton to you, you're passing the baton to me, right? So basically the Chinese were passing on the baton to the Americans of all the stuff that was made in China, and all that stuff was substantially cheaper 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but not so much anymore because Chinese wages are rising.
Right.
So the question then, the big question for American inflation.
Sorry, just
Yeah.
before you go there, how did the tariffs, the trade war, affect inflation?
It would
then?
have affected it in a negative way. It would have pushed up prices.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. So that would have pushed up prices as well. So then the question is now, so if you look at all this kit that we use here for the podcast, right?
Yeah.
There was a time that would all have been made in Germany
Yeah.
because it's better. I thought, is it still made in Germany? Now a lot of the stuff I'd say is made in China. Right?
Yeah.
It's cheap.
German company, actually. Yeah.
It's like, a German company making it in China, saving money, then re-exporting. So China has been this massive deflationary force in the world, right? Because China was catching up and because China was cheap. But now there's no reason to believe in the future. You know, that baton idea, that
Yeah.
China will be passing on a low price baton to the United States in the relay. I'm not sure that's going to be the case anymore. So basically that massive deflationary bias that was there in the last
Right.
20 years maybe becomes a neutral bias or an inflationary bias. So that's what you've got to worry about more. So what I would say in the States is there's a couple of things going on. One is when the American economy
Yeah.
is operating now at a growth rate about 10% higher. It's growing about 10% annualized right now.
Wow, that's huge.
Huge, right? So American supply,
Yeah.
okay, the production capacity of the economy hasn't adjusted to that, right?
Okay.
The benign scenario is that the American production capacity will expand and therefore prices will fall. Right, that's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing is, what about the impact of China? Does China become a deflationary or an inflationary force? They're all the things, they're the imponderables. But what I would say to you is that it seems highly likely to me that this 4.2 rate of inflation, you won't see that again, that type of number. It'll
So-
actually fall down, again, coming from the base effects more than anything
Yeah.
else.
So you're saying that 4.2 inflation might not be accurate at all. So there mightn't be any inflation as such
Well-
if you're taking in the base level first.
Yeah, I think there will be some because the economy is recovering. But
Yeah.
at its core, I think economists misdiagnose a lot of things about inflation. So economists, particularly monetary economists, will say inflation is related to the money supply. And if
Yeah.
the money supply expands, but at
Other
its,
economists, you mean?
other economists, yeah, exactly. Other lads. You know, it's like a broad church. It's a broad church. You know, it's an interpretation of the scripture. Okay, so you have the Lutherans, the Methodists, the
Yeah.
the Plymouth Brethren, the
Preacher
Catholics,
Dave, go on,
the
go
whole
for it.
thing. But it is like so. At its core, inflation is about power. It's about the power to pass on price increases. So if you look at it like that, so have workers got the power to demand higher wages? Yes, then you're going to get inflation. It's about power. Does a company have the pricing power to pass on higher prices? If that's yes, then you're in an inflationary situation. And what you are then, John, is having this battle, I think we've talked about it before, between Schumpeter and Phillips, right? The Phillips curve is about the relationship between unemployment and inflation, which is basically the idea that you can have low unemployment, but you got to have high inflation. They go together. And the reason is the lower the unemployment, the tighter the labor market, the more power workers have, and the higher wages, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you can choose.
Yeah.
Schumpeter, which has basically been much more descriptive of the last 10 years, is saying, on the contrary, technological change and globalization and the gales of creative destruction and better products, that's what's driving prices down. So you have this battle between Schumpeter and Phillips. Phillips being the Phillips curve, which was the old way of looking at it, and Schumpeter, although he's well dead, is very much the new way of looking at things.
So what Schumpeter is saying is that you can still have low unemployment, but
low wages.
And low wages.
And low wages. Now, my view is that that's a disastrous situation because high wages are actually what we're here to do. Higher wages are actually, that's what economics is about.
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, the entire Biden drive is to increase wages for the average person. Right? So the Schumpeterian view is great if you're an entrepreneur. Right?
Yeah.
Because you're getting a bigger bang for your buck. You're getting more product at less wages. But ultimately, and this is the key, Keynes would say, but you need to have people to buy your products.
Yeah.
And this is the Henry Ford idea. Henry Ford paid his workers really well, not because he liked them. In actual fact, he hated workers. He hated trade unions.
Yes.
He used to employ the mob to break up trade union membership.
Yeah. He was a horrible person, actually.
But
he's a terrible racist as well.
Unbelievable anti-Semite. That was his thing.
Right.
He's anti-Semitic and anti-black and anti-trade union, right?
Yeah.
But he had one moment of inspiration, which was that I will pay my workers much better than anyone else, not because I like them, because I want them to buy my cars.
Yeah.
And his idea was that we cannot have a consumer society without a high wage society. And in fact, Ford was very much ahead of his time in many, many things, but apparently a very deeply, deeply unpleasant person. So the idea that wages can remain low for long is, I think, a fallacy, right? That the whole objective of new economics and Bidenomics is to bring inflation up and bring wages up. But this print from this week, I think, over-eggs the pudding a little bit. And the really key thing to watch, and we're going to talk about house prices in a second, but the key thing to watch is this Chinese baton. If China becomes an inflationary source in the world, then we're in then we are in a brave new world, and all bets are off.
So, and just as a headline figure of 4.2% or whatever, that's going to be spun.
Oh yeah,
like you wouldn't believe by the Republican side.
Well,
saying Bidenomics doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, he's going to run the country.
But you know the great thing
about
Joe Biden, he doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
No, I mean that's the amazing thing about him. I was even watching him in this Arab-Israeli thing. Usually, if the Israelis and the Palestinians were involved in the horrendous stuff that's going on now, the Americans would have an envoy straight away.
Yeah.
Biden's not doing anything. He's kind of said to Netanyahu, you fix it. You started it.
Yeah.
You fix it. So in a way, Biden is not, what I like about Biden is that he seems to me to be unencumbered by noise, right? And he doesn't react. Contrast that with Trump, right? If Trump was on, right, he doesn't react. He says, I've got a pandemic in my hands. I've got an economy that needs healing on my hands. I want to figure out our relationship with China. I want to figure out our relationship with Russia. These are my big foreign policy and domestic policy. I've an environmental policy that I want to get sorted.
Yeah.
And he's not affected by the noise. And that's
because he's asleep.
But that's that sort of single-mindedness, John, Jesus, interests me.
So we're talking about inflation there. And of course, a related topic is housing, which we talk about a lot.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But it's interesting. I saw a thing on CNN there with a load of
fake news. Go on.
But it was really interesting. They were saying that house price, because it's not just housing we go on about in Ireland, but it's a very big issue right across the world.
Yeah.
And CNN were talking about this, where they were saying house prices across 37 different countries in the OECD have risen by 6.7%. Between 2019 and 2020. And they were saying it's the fastest year-on-year growth in the past 20 years.
Yeah, no, it's happening all over the world. I mean, we become obsessed in Ireland because it's the conversation that Irish people are having.
Yeah.
It's the conversation that Irish politics is having. In fact, Micheál Martin came out the other day and it was like a light bulb moment. He says, the single biggest issue for young people is housing. I felt like, man, you're only tweaking that now.
Yeah.
You know, but let's go broader.
He was down with the kids,
He was down with the kids. No, but let's go broader.
Yeah.
Which is that you're seeing this in all major urban areas all around the world. London, for example, house prices in England are up 8.5% last year, right? Despite it being probably the worst recession in 3 centuries. Think about it. Right?
Yeah.
So normally what happens with house prices is they go with income.
Yeah.
So basically they go with GDP. So if GDP is falling, house prices will generally be falling. But what has happened in this pandemic is something quite different, right? Which is an extraordinary, for example, again, we'll go back to London, right?
Yeah.
London house prices that are within an hour commute of London have gone up by 10% this year.
Right.
British house
Just this year alone?
Yeah, just this year alone.
Wow.
Right, British house prices. And in actual fact, if you talk to anybody involved in the property game in England, they'll say that houses in really nice rural areas have gone up even more because lots and lots of Londoners are saying, well, if I'm going to be able to work for 3 days a week or 2 days a week at home, I don't want to live in Putney, where I believe the Davis fortune is stashed.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't want to, I don't want to live there and be tube bound. I'm going to live miles away. And you're seeing the same thing in New York, you're seeing this in San Francisco. Think about this in China as well, what they call tier 1 cities, Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou. Prices have risen by 12% on average year on year, right? So we're seeing this all over the world. And there's now what they call a race for space. Now, remember we talked about panic buying. This is what I think. And remember we just said recently, just a minute ago about inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation is about power. It's a power to be able to increase prices. So home sellers, house sellers now have all the power. They have the power to increase prices and prices are going up. And we've talked about the buyer's strike before. Like if I was 30 years old, there's no way I'd get involved in this market.
Yeah.
Because it's just too dysfunctional. And I was watching something the other day on Netflix, John.
All right.
It's an interview with Debbie Harry.
Brilliant.
Debbie Harry, looking extraordinary.
Yeah.
Right?
It's just a recent interview.
Yeah, like last year with Anthony Bourdain.
Right.
And it was amazing, right? Because what they were talking about culture. They were talking about, obviously Bourdain and Debbie Harry, broadly around the same generation, hung out in New York in the kitchens, hung out in the Lower East Side and the CBGB places, right?
Yeah.
It's Andy Warhol and it's, it's Patti Smith and it's Blondie.
When New York was really
and it's
cool.
the New York Dolls and it's television and all that great stuff, right? When New York was really cool.
Yeah.
And they were talking about New York being really cool and creative and interesting. But what I got from this, they were actually talking about housing because they were making the link between the fact that New York was affordable for all these misfits and oddities and creatives and whatever. And the fact that once you put together all these people in a creative stew, so to speak, in the Lower East Side, amazing things happen because people meet each other, right? Yeah. And they were making the point that, and it's true, if you're in Manhattan now, the only art is upscale art galleries. Like if you go to Manhattan, there's no sense now, the Lower East Side. I mean, the Lower East Side is where Kavanagh has his bar now.
Yeah.
Or had his bar. He closed it down. What was it called?
The Red Line?
No, the Dorian Gray.
Oh, the Dorian Gray.
But the Red Line was on Bleecker Street.
Yeah.
Where all of Monkstown works illegally every year. Finest kitchen porters, the finest kitchen porters in the whole of America came from Monkstown in the Red Line. No, but the Lower East Side. So they were making the point. They were riffing about music and art and culture and literature and whatever, and the punk movement.
Yeah.
But what they were actually saying, like if you think that punk was all about DIY, do it yourself, right? You don't need anything, you can do it yourself. But what they were making the point was once, and it's well, they didn't make the point, but I was thinking this, right?
Right.
But once
they should have made the
they
point.
should have made the point, right? I was going to ring up Blondie and say, Debbie, got a point here for you. But of course, Bourdain is now dead, which is one of the great tragedies. Because I actually met Bourdain, did I tell you?
No, go on, tell us.
I interviewed him for Agenda years ago,
right?
And we met, the extraordinary thing is, because Agenda was on TV3 on Sunday morning, it was very niche, which means no audience. But it was great because it wasn't on RTE. We could decide what current affairs was. Because if you're doing a similar program on RTE, you'd have producers and editors, and they'd be forcing you to talk to, I don't know, finance ministers or something like that. That's their perception. I was calling it Oireachtas current affairs. It's Leinster House television, right? But we couldn't decide what current affairs was. And we decided, let's go to New York and interview lots of people, but Bourdain, not about food, but about the people in the restaurant.
Right.
Who are they? Where do they live? And I'm going to give you a quote from Bourdain about the restaurant, because again, it comes back to my time as a fantastic dishwasher, one of the finest dishwashers ever, right? But Bourdain was talking about the people in Kitchen Confidential. Have you ever read his book?
No, I haven't.
It's a gem, right? The people who work in restaurants. So he says, so who the hell exactly are these guys, the boys and girls in the trenches, right? In the kitchens, right?
Yeah.
You might get the impression from the specifics of my less than stellar career that all line cooks are whacked out moral degenerates, dope fiends, refugees, thuggish assortments of drunks, snake thieves, sluts, and psychopaths. You wouldn't be too far off base. The business, as the respected 3-star chef Scott Bryan explains, attracts fringe elements, right? People for whom something in their lives has gone terribly wrong. Or maybe, just like me, they like it here.
Right. Yeah.
But the question is, where do those people live? This is the interesting thing.
Yeah.
If house prices go up too much, if the city becomes unaffordable, people like that cannot live. So the city then loses its soul, because a city should be a melting pot of all sorts of people. Because what is so attractive about cities is the fact that a city sucks in people from all over for a variety of different reasons. You know, people go for ambition, they go for wages, they go for
to make
fame.
it functional, to make it the city function, you know, on a very basic level.
Exactly. You know, and if you think about, you know, if you look historically why people left small places to go to cities, like I was always intrigued when we were in New York or in London, you'd meet these people or you'd hear them, older men in particular and women from the west of Ireland with really, really like very, very heavy Mayo or Galway accents, Connemara accents. And yet the beautiful thing about the city is they can find their place, right? So these people, and I remember TK's uncles, I met them from Mayo.
Yeah.
Many of them hadn't been to Dublin. They went straight from Mayo to London on the mailboat here from Dunleary. And they were, but they found their place. And these were adventurous people and transformational people and people who said, you know what, I'm going to go and make something of my life. So cities,
but they remained very Mayo, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But so cities have to be this extraordinary blend of social strata, right? And what Bourdain is making the point is, you know, if the kitchen porter cannot live within, you know, a couple of blocks or commuting distance, but I don't mean like commuting in terms of the restaurant, then it all begins to atrophy. And what you get is gentrification. Gentrification isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but what it does, it destroys the soul of the city.
Yeah.
And the soul of the city is the beating commercial idea that all these restaurants, whether it's in Dublin or New York, they all need to function. So the point I took from that conversation was that cities need to provide a refuge, a home, a place. I mean, if you look at why people go to cities, you know, all sorts of things. In fact, I was reading a great book called Metropolis recently, and he's making the point that most people go to cities for sex.
Right.
It's really interesting, you know, for liberation, for stuff you can't get at home.
Yeah. I know, well, that makes sense. It's part of the exploration.
Yeah. It's
part of the adventure.
Exactly. And therefore it has to, and I was also reading about the Greek agora, John.
Yeah.
So the Greeks had an amazing idea that they put the market at the center of the city, right? And that was the thriving hub of the city. So people came, peddlers and hawkers and hustlers and people from all over the place, right, came to the center. So unlike other civilizations, which used to put the garrison or they put the king's palace or they put the great, you know, cathedral to such and such, right? The Greeks always put the market. And the reason they did is they understood that the city has to be alive. So if you know, Aristotle, the Greeks were obsessed about being a citizen. How do you be a good citizen? This is their thing. How do you be a good citizen? You be a good citizen by learning to live together. And you don't learn to live with people of your own social class. You learn to live together with people of different social classes.
Sure.
And that's what always intrigued me about, you know, the cosmopolitan nature of cities, or even the expression, you know, to be urbane. You know that idea, you know, because people think, urbane means you're, I don't know,
sophisticated in some sort of way.
Yeah, or suave or well-educated or well-read. I actually don't think that I think being urbane is something much more interesting. It's actually being an urban person, being somebody who can live in the city, who's open to the possibilities of the city, who's kind of messy. Cities have to be messy.
Yeah.
Because messiness is at the core. And it's funny when you hear Bourdain talking about cities, what's the thing? It's the messiness, It's not about clean lines. In fact, sometimes when I hear architects say, no, we should have all buildings like this, right? I always think, no, clean lines is anti-urban. Urbanity and the urban world is a messy, random, unpredictable.
Well, it's the melting pot.
The old phrase. So when I was thinking that we should introduce the Bourdain approach to cities, which is that a city will work if in every restaurant, from the kitchen porter to the commis chef, the side chef, the sous chef, the maitre d', to the swankiest table.
Yeah.
Out by the window when people can look at you, right? Look at me, I'm in the swanky table, right? All those people should be able to live within 15 minutes of the restaurant. That should be the aim of the 15-minute city, because then you will get this extraordinary energy that cities need to have to grow, because if they don't have their own internal energy, they'll just become amusement parks for rich people.
Yeah.
Who go in and say, well, I'll go to a swanky restaurant and then I'll drive home.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you lose all that the creative juices of a city. And that's the challenge for places like Dublin. How do you get poor people to live in the city? You build subsidized housing and you get rich people to pay for it. And that's the essence.
One day, watched a fight between a Aussie couple escalate. Strawberry cheeks flushed with defeated rage. Then he spilled his coffee as he frantically explained. Maybe if you took a breath, you would hear me when I talk to you. Threw her necklace in his face. Suddenly he started screaming. As she ran, panicking and weaving through the crowds on Oxford Street. Watched his world dissolve in his hands. Tried to roll a blunt and put his head between his knees. Maybe if she took a breath, she would know I did it all for her. Agony and hints of sage, her eyes blind with disappointment. I couldn't recognize her face. Shards of glass live in this feeling. Have to somehow stop her leaving.